Well, good morning. It's now Sunday. We are September the 27th. We are heading into the last week of Q3 of 2020, gearing up for the last quarter of 2020. And as our guest today, we have Rob Laurie. And Rob will introduce himself in one moment. But today's topic is on urban vertical farming. It has taken root, as we would say, pun intended. And we're going to review not just the opportunities that we're seeing globally, but also the good, the bad, and the ugly, as the industry would like to say, for those that either may wish to be a project proponent or considering either investing in technology involving vertical farming. So Rob, without further ado, let me introduce you, and then let's have our Sunday morning coffee TheraCann chat and dive right in. So Rob, go ahead.
Thank you, Chris. Well, my name is Robert Laurie. I'm Senior Advisor to TheraCann International Benchmark Corporation, which is a leading global full turnkey solutions and critical infrastructure provider for the food, cannabis, and psychedelic industries. I'm also a practicing lawyer with international credentials, qualified in England and called to the bar in British Columbia. And I am the principal of Ad Lucem Law Corporation, founded in Vancouver, where my legal practice focuses on commercial, business, government, and regulatory issues surrounding cannabis and plant medicines. Great to be back again, Chris. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Rob. Always a pleasure. So Rob is sitting in his home office during COVID in Nanaimo on Vancouver Island, Canada. And I'm sitting here in the home office 7 minutes away from our Center of Excellence, which is the picture you see me behind me in Panama Pacifico here in Panama. And for our topic today, we are talking about vertical urban farming. For what it's worth, the CEO of TheraCann, we did see opportunity as early as 2015 for the ability to take complex agricultural grow operations and move them indoor. And the reason for that, one, we wanted to be able to repeat very complex batches of plant, of cannabis in particular, where we had to be able to replicate cannabinoids and terpenes. And to do that, we had to control root causes of variation. And to do that, the only way to adequately control was to move it indoors. But we saw within a few years, industries begin to pop up around the planet that were going not just for cannabis or not cannabis at all, but taking what we used to take for granted as mom's garden grow and sticking it inside. So leafy greens and herbs, even fruits and vegetables. Now, the purpose of our talk today is we're seeing the growth in this industry accelerate. And for example, last week, we certainly were intrigued, and I'm just looking on the screen. I'll share links below our TheraCAST upload, so you have these links as well as an audience. But InFarm, which is an international company like our own, just completed $170 million in equity and debt to continue to build its vertical farming network, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. That, of course, for those who were following CNN even a few months ago, watched Elon Musk's brother, and that's Elon's brother, who went straight into transforming farming to vertical, for which again the minimum investment into that project was well over 100 million, and so on and so forth. I don't think I've seen a project that hasn't attracted more than 100 million. And why is that, Rob? What's got this new sector taking off faster than we've ever seen any other?
Well, a lot has to do with the fact that, well, over the last 40 years, the planet has lost a third of arable lands, meaning that what we were once farming on and producing food has either been destroyed or converted into other uses, predominantly urban development. And so with that, you're seeing, and on top of it with COVID virus, you're seeing changes in the ways that, well, traditionally food was being sourced, transported, and delivered to market. Despite food and food transportation being designated a essential service, there still is the question of food miles and food dollars and the cost of both in bringing food that is produced on the other side of the world to your table in another jurisdiction. And in an effort to address these realities, we're seeing a increase in the interest in vertically integrated farming within urban contexts. And I think, again, we're starting to see businesses as well as individuals recognize that the traditional issues of opportunity cost along with scarcity principle are dictating that better choices and better sustainability has to be factored into producing food and doing business. So this is why we're now seeing such an increase, because a lot of these technologies that are part of successful vertically integrated systems assemblage is something that TheraCann has been doing for a number of years very successfully in the cannabis space. And we've been seeing that this technology and our approaches to producing cannabis in a vertically integrated fashion is very sustainable, very economical, and addresses both those issues of more profitable use of space, so opportunity cost, and of course scarcity principle, because you're requiring less inputs and less outputs to effectively achieve a greater capital outcome.
Well, thanks for that answer. That's a long and detailed one for sure. And taking what we're seeing indoors on the surface from a municipal standpoint, even from a remote community standpoint, makes a heck of a lot of sense, right? And you can't rely during COVID, for example, as we saw, no one expected that supply chains for food that would have to travel thousands of kilometers to get to final market would survive. Many were disrupted or delayed, and with any perishable product, that has an immediate impact both to the bottom and the top line of the business. So putting this back in urban, for the large part of it, makes immediate sense, but it forgoes the challenges of taking what does grow outdoor in dirt and sticking it inside a building. And for all the issues that are associated with that, be it moisture, be it contaminant, be it labor costs, power costs, and on and on. And we very much addressed those going back 3 years ago in our plan design, and thankfully we went through our pilot of doing that in the building right behind us, right here on, 3 degrees off the equator, to demonstrate it could be done in the middle of the jungle. Panama has the largest jungle in its city in the world. It's a designated area. And so all the things that want to kill your crop are here, be it bugs, pests, be it mold and bacteria. And we were able to show it can be done. But it does come at a cost. And so Rob, just again, for our audience that may be kind of new to this, what were you seeing with regards to capital costs of having to run some of these projects? And again, just from your point of view, how economic is it to grow a head of lettuce that sells for $1 a pound if you're building these type of structures? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yes, the argument is that if you are able to scale and replicate, then you should, in theory, be producing more, which in turn means that your per unit cost should decrease, which is, again, ties in very importantly with the dichotomy of technology versus food. And what we're seeing is a lot of companies who either have very good tech but can't produce food, or they can produce food and the tech isn't very good. And I think that's where TheraCann has an advantage, is that, as I alluded to earlier, the tech, the process, and the approach as to how to most efficiently use the square footage and space to produce a more profitable outcome has been a process that has been perfected and refined over time in the context of course, legal cannabis production. But of course, seeing now that the demand for food and that we're seeing effectively urban centers stuck with issues of high unemployment, reduced access to food, as well as on a reliance on food from other municipalities or other parts of the country. And so with all that being said, this effectively is an opportunity for governments and communities internationally to effectively be looking at how to get the most out of a fixed set of resources. And that, I think, ties into the reality that people just don't have budgets to get it wrong. And like chess, if you haven't thought out your moves in advance of making them, then it'll be very difficult, I think, to manage the space. But that's where, from my perspective, TheraCann is very nicely positioned.
Well, thanks, Rob, and thanks for that. And we've seen quite a number of different models, and we're going to share a few of those now, just going to put all this in perspective. For those that entered the vertical urban farm without having the benefit of going through the cannabis market, effectively took what they were doing in a greenhouse and tipping it vertical. So they, instead of a long flat table with a bunch of aisles, that with a lot of space between the table and the top of the greenhouse, what they were doing is taking, instead of a flood table, usually a tube or a rack that is still full of water, that's gravity fed, and they'd run these super high into a very tall warehouse space. And some of these are glassed, which is somewhat amusing because there's no adequate way to get the equal amount of light through those panels. And in our experience in working in projects as in northern Canada and certainly down in New Zealand, we've done both poles and all points in between, trying to get consistent light to get a consistent crop and a consistent batch every place you go. Relying just on panels with open window is not reliable. The other trouble that we have with flood tables going vertical is, I don't know if you've ever watched, Rob, but I think I shared a few of these state-of-the-art facilities with you, and there's pools of water all over the floor. And that's chronic because there's just so much water in the facility. And for locations that we work in, whether it's Central Australia or South Africa, for example, which have extreme water constraints, wasting water like that is not optimal. It also creates the environment for mold and bacteria and home for pests, and it's just, it doesn't, I'll say it doesn't work well.
I didn't mention aeroponics, which is a very important key word and distinguishing feature of how TheraCann produces cannabis and leafy greens. And so for our viewers out there, a good majority of facilities utilize aquaponics, very water intensive production processes, whereas aeroponics, which the TheraCann Sprout AI system utilizes, is aeroponics, meaning that the root systems are suspended and sprayed with precision on a very controlled schedule, the right nutrients and inputs for the benefit of not wasting what goes in. So ultimately, people say that a disadvantage of vertical farming at the level and complexity that TheraCann does is it's expensive. Well, it is if you don't know what you're doing. But if you do know what you're doing, you can actually realize economies of scale, which these large greenhouses, which, well, let's face it, trying to grow cannabis in large airport hangars does not enable you to have the same degree of control and precision over your environment. And ultimately growing within controlled cells, which you can replicate vertically and horizontally to maximize your floor space, also offers the added advantage of, should something go wrong in any of your cells, well, just like watertight compartments on a battleship, you are basically able to cordon off that section of the ship, prevent any further flooding. Just like in a grow, should something be contaminated, at least you're able to quarantine that section off at the expense of saving the rest of your crop.
Right, right.
And to just bring in the issue too of labor. It's funny, I've spoken with some of my clients who have operated large grows on various sides of legality. And in the old days, you know, you'd be bringing in a crew of maybe 30 to 60 people, depending on the size of the grow, every 3 weeks to a month. And utilizing the TheraCann Sprout AI system, from what I've been privy to, means that you can get your labor down to about a 15-member crew working on a rotating schedule, which again, with the vertically integrated indoor controlled farming, means you can grow on a schedule and time and coordinate your labor with that. So again, it's a more complicated, but if done properly, a very highly orchestrated and coordinated process, which should differentiate companies like TheraCann from, well, those producing cannabis in dirt and hoop houses.
Yeah, well, thanks, Rob. So lots of points to cover off there. And again, just to help our audience who may be starting from scratch on this, think of it this way. At the end of the day, we have a number of primary constraints in starting any new indoor vertical farming project. Number one, investors aren't interested in putting or sinking capital into a stranded asset. It can't be so special purpose of a building that if you need to abandon it or outgrow it and move on, you can't resell it except to someone else who's doing it the same way as you've just left it. And that's not practical. We saw that as version 1 cannabis, version 2 cannabis, version 3 cannabis. And until we showed and demonstrated that a warehouse, an existing warehouse, can be set up in a way very quickly with Sprout, which, by the way, this, as we haven't explained very well, is a series of rolling racks that are 3 to 5 levels high. Each has habitats that are 10 feet long by 5 feet wide by 6 feet tall, 5 habitats per row, and we'll share images on this below this cast so you can see what we're talking about. And they're feather light to roll, but each habitat is its own control zone. Each habitat has its own batch of crop. And in cannabis, that's 32 plants. In terms of berries, that would be closer to 60. But each of these is timed to come off on an hourly basis in a facility of roughly 35,000 square feet. And so you can have 3 shifts that are harvesting every hour, every hour, every hour, every hour. It also reduces your power costs. We are using LEDs because power comes with a cost. And we have to be able to balance that against the people who think that the sunshine is 100% all day, every day, 365 days a year. We can show that this can be done indoors much more consistently. And then, of course, as you said, aeroponics using water, and even the opportunity to recycle the return water back into the system, be ultra green as a consequence, right? So that was model number 1. The other model that we saw and in which we did explore in 2015, 2016 were containers, which was taking seed cans and putting the cultivation areas into the seed cans and then stacking the seed cans inside. These are shipping containers, big 20 to 40 footers, into a warehouse. As easy as that sounds, it's not. You have to get a special crane to be able to lift it into place. It's not something that comes apart easy. Then you have to pay a fortune on catwalks to get it all lined up, whereas we use a scissor lift that's relatively cost effective and easy to go up to each of these habitats with 1 or 2 people to harvest and roll it along. So long story short, there is a lot of gotchas if you're not careful. And because the margins for leafy greens and what we'll call herbs, microgreens, fruit and vegetables could be relatively thin, depending on the market. You have to be extremely well thought through on how your input costs are going to be to match your revenues. Now, one of the things that we've done, which is unique though, is try to balance the crop. And for communities, and maybe you could share a little bit more about this from what you're hearing, but we could use a project without naming them in Zimbabwe or South Africa, in northern communities in Canada, if you want to share some information on that, as to how they're looking to balance the crop between a controlled substance crop to one that puts food on the table. One effectively is generating sufficient revenue to almost subsidize the cost of the other, while the project is recovering full ROI within 12 to 24 months of creation. So what are you seeing by the way of those that really dove into this, Rob? We could help some of these listeners catch up. Are we just growing lettuce, or what else are we wanting to do in these facilities, get better cost recovery? Go ahead.
Well, cannabis, of course, which is what we've been doing, leafy heads of lettuce, various fruit and berries, it's technical, or plants which grow berries, and of course fungi. Again, using a aeroponic root nutrient system with controlled lighting and a controlled grow schedule, that's ultimately where we're going to see opportunities to do a number of things and pivot, or be able to at least pivot safely into the psychedelic and plant medicine opportunities with this type of technology. And ultimately, that's what governments, regulators, banks, and auditors are going to want to and need to see in order for any of this type of new licensing to do anything involving restricted or controlled substances. Will certainly need to be in place. So that positions, I believe, TheraCann nicely to deal with, well, cannabis production, as it's been doing for a number of years and doing well, in addition to leafy greens, which of course allows you for other forms of plant production. So we can call that plant medicine. And it's interesting for communities that are not just located in urban environments, but in remote areas, such as northern Alberta, or remote parts of Africa, South Africa, Australia. Well, these this type of aeroponic growth systems are enabling communities not only to have a revenue generating crop with a margin such as cannabis, but also the ability to sustainably produce food for either the consumption of the town or neighboring communities, businesses, and camps, for example, mining camps, oil and gas camps, fishing camps, etc. All of these endeavors are generally located in remote, difficult to access areas, meaning that regular access to fresh fruit and vegetable, let alone, probably not fresh cannabis, but ultimately fresh fruit and vegetable into these more remote areas should enable diversified revenue and income schemes for those businesses and communities that take advantage of this technology.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And what really came down to us, and it wasn't so much planned for, it was more of a way to mitigate large scale loss of crop. And we had watched with some concern, certainly again in Canada, we saw other instances of this elsewhere in the world, but in Canada in particularly, being there from the get-go, first a large operation was 5,000 square feet. It's just grandma's basement, replicated a few extra times, and then that went to 10, went to 100, went to 1,000,000 square feet. And what was happening is like we saw in British Columbia, without naming the LP, a licensed producer, they lost 3 greenhouses in a week, and it cost $40 million in lost product, which was a reportable event to their shareholders. And we looked at that in earnest and said, well, they apparently couldn't feel they could have done anything to avoid it. So that being the case, you have to reduce the size of the batches. Now, the benefit of doing that is you can only need to grow what you need to grow. And so if you're in a community that has a preference for one type of leafy green or microgreen and not another, just grow what you want. And that could change seasonally. You can mix and match it. You could start small and scale up or scale down without having to tear apart the building. The other thing that we found for costs, and again, we share this, is trying to heat or cool an entire enclosed space with open bedded tables filled with water is impractical on a good day and horribly expensive on its worst. We had to take the environments and put them into much more smaller contained spaces and allow the warehouse to be normal. And so like the building behind us here, where the ambient temperature is 35 degrees Celsius and the humidity is 98, we were able to demonstrate that we could grow these crops successfully inside a habitat without an exorbitant amount of power to HVAC the whole warehouse. We don't have to do that. The other challenge that we have, of course, is it has to meet a compliance standard, and that is either going to be a GMP or a CGMP, a European GMP standard, and because it's in the warehouse and it's processed there, it'll have to be GPP standard, and it's a hell of a hard road to cross when you can't show consistency to an auditor. And by dialing it all into these small spaces using artificial intelligence, that is effectively managing these crops during the course of them, we can further dial this in to the point of repeatability, whether it's Sydney, Australia, or Sydney, Nova Scotia, Canada, it doesn't matter. We can replicate. We can make exactly the same batch. And that, I think, for entrepreneurs is really the future. If you've got a large brand out there, and we saw this with Wendy's, right? Wendy's went urban. Wendy's is now an urban vertical farm customer. Who would have thought? Why? Because during COVID, they wanted security of their lettuce. And it had to look the same way, and it had to taste the same way, no matter where you went to Wendy's. The franchise pressure to consolidate and make the food consistent forced it into vertical. That's very interesting to us. We didn't see that coming that quickly, right? But think of other brands, especially those that are specialty. We talk about plant-based medicine. Now, whether that's in an indigenous community who will have the right to cultivate and consume their own product, or whether it becomes part of a national schema. South Africa being a good case in point, Canada being a good case in point, Jamaica being a good case in point. Now New Zealand is voting on the very same. Being able to add more SKUs to the line will become important. But for a very large international brand, how could you ever be sure it's going to be the same if you can't dial in those constraints? So that's where we see the big opportunity. And
well, also global warming, because you have farmers in Mendocino, California, banging on about how superior their outdoor growing cannabis is, which technically the longitude and latitude with combination of climate change in the last 20 to 40 years, I don't know how ideal outdoor growing in some of these traditional regions is, or how good this is at the end of the day, because it reminds me of wine. Because of global warming, some of the a cultivar of grape that you would be finding traditionally in Bordeaux regions, funny enough, they can't produce because of the changes, and you're finding these grapes they thought extinct now in South America because of the changes. So how can you be producing a product in, I don't know, 1976 and claim that it in 2020, 44 years later, is still the same product? And that, to me, if we're looking at this as ultimately, if we're producing cannabis as a medicine, or to make that argument that what we're producing closely resembles medicine than something grown over here by, guys in blue jeans growing in dirt outside. And ultimately, can you control your environment, I think, is the ultimate question. And outdoors, unless the weather is the same every day, and there are some regions like that, ultimately, though, that's not going to be the most certain bang for your buck. And to conclude, I touched on it earlier. Governments just don't have the resources. I mean, this isn't Cannabis 1.0 where you could throw, $1 billion at a problem and hope you fix it. Well, no, now it's, you don't break ground unless you're clear from soup to nuts, from project start to project finish and into production, that your metrics and markers will be hit.
Well, that's a good point. And why don't we wrap up now, because we're right at the end of our 30, our Sunday morning coffee chat, which I truly enjoy, Rob. But one of the things I have noticed, and this has come to us in 1 week, 2 countries at country levels have approached us with regards to urban planning and putting in, well, actually that's 3 if we include Canada. So in that case, in each and every case, they want, as part of their urban planning, their urban planners, to include vertical farm. And they're babes in the woods. They're not sure how to do it. They see stories like the case in Vancouver, where the mayor of Vancouver, which supported a rooftop vertical grow that went bankrupt very quickly after the city injected so much into it. But then, of course, there are the success stories, and in planning these projects early so that they are as sustainable as possible for energy and water, and properly positioned to be close to their local market, does make a lot of sense. But they don't have to be massive. They don't have to be football field size. Like, I mean, it may be better on economies of scale to keep these, like the building behind us, that isn't a football field, but allows you to have it close to the community and get it going and running that way. And that this is where you go to get your leafy greens. You can even put in your own order if you wanted to. In fact, in our model, each habitat could be a household. The household could say, I want this and this and this and this cultivated in there, and provided that they're all being harvested roughly at the same time, we could certainly accommodate that. But anyways, long story short, I think this is going to be incredibly exciting over the next couple of years. We don't know how COVID will continue to change us socially. We've been working sequestered in our home offices for better part of 3/4 of a year. That was my office right behind me, and I have not worked in there since the first week of February. Do I mind working from my desktop here? No. Do I like being able to chat with people around the planet and see where they where they live and what's running around the house for pets. I love that. I think that's great, and that's changed. The same for schooling, right? And we're seeing for the first time since the Second World War a massive drop in enrollment as everyone has either learned to homeschool or taken the chance at it. My point in all this is I don't think people have quite seen it yet, but there is a massive change coming with regards to how we're going to grow our food, and putting it in close to the people who need it may very well be here to stay. And it will stay if it's repeatable, economic, practical, scalable, safe, and secure. And that's what we're all about.
Leaves less of a footprint.
Yeah, less of a footprint, absolutely. So thank you, Rob. Those are good insights. So what we'll share at the bottom of the TheraCAST is we do have links to a few of these stories. You just need to Google vertical urban farm, and you'll see a pile, put in the word investment, and you'll see these major projects popping up around the globe. There are some really good papers out there as well. I'll be loading one from 2017 that's free, doesn't require a license to download. That gives you some good metrics. Mind you, that was 3 years ago. Aeroponics has come a long way from 3 years ago as we've helped develop. So it isn't completely accurate with regards to our benefits over hydroponic, but it does show that all of that is better than a greenhouse and wildly more efficient than an outdoor grow. So thank you for that. We'll also put up a little presentation as to what Sprout's about, so you can see this in action and the type of things we've been growing in it. So I hope that helps. And then we're here. We are two of a team of experts that are sitting internationally. And
Solutions architects.
Solution architects. And we are a group of well-trained, seasoned entrepreneurs that do have multi-international experiences. We understand legal frameworks more than the average bear, and we do spot trends well before they arrive. So I'm encouraging you to reach out to us if you've got some interesting questions, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.